So in this video, we're going to talk about polypainting. Polypainting is a method of painting in Zbrush that's completely independent of UV coordinates. It's based on per vertex color. So with a model like this, which has 3 million polygons, if each vertex gets an RGB value, we're able to produce a very high frequency texture map. Now there's a few things that I want to do to this model before we begin. First off, I want to give the render a certain degree of translucency so we get a clearer picture of what the skin will look like when it's rendered with subsurface. So I'm currently on the startup material, which is essentially the basic material too. I want to make sure that the head is filled with that material, so I turn on the material channel and go to color, fill object, and that just fills the whole head with the basic material too. Now I'm going to go to the material settings and I'm going to open up wax modifier. I'm going to set that to about 50% and click OK. Now under render, I need to go to render properties and turn on wax preview to see that wax shader in action. So that gives us a little bit of translucency to this material. If I turn up the strength, you can see it even more. It just helps the skin feel more like skin. Now the next thing I want to change is the specular highlight. I'll do that by going to material and opening up modifiers. Under modifiers, I have a specular slider and specular curve. I'm going to broaden the specular curve so the specular component is less sharp. It looks less like plastic. And then I'm going to turn the specular shine down, and that's going to give us an effect more like skin. So with that done, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at how to access Polypaint. Under the Tool menu, there is a Polypaint menu. And if I turn Colorize on and off, you see that that turns the Polypaint on and off. If I go to my subtool palette and I press this button here, which is a paintbrush, that turns the Polypaint on and off as well. Now I want to clear the Polypaint out of the RGB channel on this Z tool. So what I'll do is I'm going to select a base color. I'll just go to the palette here, the color picker, and I'm going to select kind of a pasty, pale, unhealthy skin tone. Make sure my RGB is set to 100 and I will go to color, fill object, and this will make sure that RGB is turned on. I had material turned on, so RGB needs to be turned on for this to work. Go to color, fill object, and that now fills the object with that base color. And I'm actually going to lighten the value of that a little bit and then fill it again. Color, fill object. There we go. That's more what I want for my base color. Now I want to start painting on the object using Polypaint. So I'm going to use the standard brush. I'm going to leave it on the dot stroke and I'm going to turn off Z-add. Now you can add color and sculpt at the same time, and sometimes that might be desirable if maybe you're doing a scarification or tattoo, or you just want to paint as well as sculpt. In this case, we're just going to paint, so we're going to turn off Z-add. Now because we filled the model with a color value, if I change my color now, it won't update on the model, but I can paint this value onto the object. But this paint stroke is very even and very much like a spray can. It's not really what I want. I want something a little bit more broken up. So I'm going to change my stroke to this spray stroke. Don't select color spray, select spray. Spray will break up the brush stroke into a bunch of little dots. Now under the stroke palette here, you've got a color slider. Make sure that this is set to 0. If color is set higher than 0, ZBrush will slightly modulate your color selection, and that's not necessarily what we want. So now you see it's a little bit more broken up, but not quite what we're looking for. So let's further break up this brush by going to the Alpha palette and selecting Alpha 7. That's a bunch of little dots. Now our stroke looks like this. So the idea here is that I want to create my texture from a bunch of passes of little broken up dots of color. Now this is based on how I learned to paint using an airbrush. My background was makeup effects, so I spent a lot of time painting masks and props and bodies and foam latex skins and silicone skins, and we would always paint using broken up dots of color and squiggly lines because most things in nature are not painted. Most naturally occurring things are not colored with just a single block of color. It's usually made up of a whole bunch of little speckles of color, and what happens is what's called optical mixing, which we'll talk about a little more in a few moments. So with my brush set up like this, I'm able to use those real world, those tangible physical media techniques here in ZBrush, which is something that I love about ZBrush. It's really an artist tool, and it does let you bring those types of workflows and techniques directly into the program. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this brush with red and we're just to spray red pretty much over the whole character, but we want to concentrate it into the areas that are going to be the warmest. And I want to keep my brush size relatively small, and I can keep my RGB intensity pretty high. Now I call this pass the temperature map. What we're doing is we're painting areas of the face that are going to be warmer. That is like the cheeks and the ears. And the lighter the skin tone, the more apparent that is. But there is a degree of warmth that you'll find in all sorts of skin tones going across the cheeks and the nose, just like this. Now we are going to place red pretty much everywhere, but I really want to concentrate it in those areas. I'm going to put it into the eye sockets. I'm going to be a little judicious getting it down here in the lower portion of the face because this is going to typically be a cooler area, especially for someone that's got hair follicles down there. If someone's got like 5 o'clock shadow, that's going to cool off that area of the face. So typically we want the lower portion of the face to be cooler. So we don't want to put too much red down there. I will put just a tiny bit through here, but not very much. And then I'll spray it down here in the neck. Now I am painting asymmetrically. I could turn on X symmetry, but this model is actually slightly asymmetrical. So I find it's just beneficial for me to go in here and just paint both sides, especially when we get into the later passes where it'll be very apparent if we're painting symmetrically and once we get to the center line of the head. So there we go. Let's put a little bit more warmth in the earlobes. Bring it up to here and here. Now I'm going to put a little bit more warmth in the nose area. And I'm going to switch color now. I'm going to click on this swatch and drag over here to somewhere where there is no red, and that's going to select the base color again. So if I switch, this is my active color. If I hold down the Alt key, it'll spray back in the base tone. So if I kind of overdo it in any particular area, I can press Alt and then spray out that red. And that should be good. So that's our first pass on the temperature map. That's the warm pass. Now I'm going to switch to blue. So I'll just come down here and select the color blue. And I'm going to spray blue into the areas of the face that are going to be cooler. Like I said, down here in the beard line, the lower portion of the face, I want this to be a little bit more blue. And again, I've got my RGB intensity set at 100. It's very important when you're doing this pass to make it overstated. I don't believe it's possible to overdo this temperature pass, but it is possible to not do it strong enough because this is an underpainting. This is going to be peeking through several layers of color by the end of our paint job. So it needs to be strong enough that we can still see it once we paint on top of it. I'm going to take blue and I'm going to paint it into the eye sockets, and watch what happens here when the blue interacts with the red. We start to get a violet. Things start to take on a purple cast. And that's our optical mixing. Optical mixing is when you place two dots of, say, two primary colors next to each other and you perceive the secondary color. So if we take red and blue and put those dots together, we see purple. We take yellow and blue, then we're going to see green. And you're going to see that happen in just a moment. I'm painting blue into the recesses here, the little hollows of the neck and in the hollows of the ear. And that's because in color theory, we know that cool colors tend to look like they're receding from us, whereas warm colors tend to look like they're advancing. So by painting a cooler hue into the recesses, we can accentuate the shadow in that depth. Because we never want to paint shadows into our texture map. We want the render to take care of that, but we can cool off areas and make them feel a little bit deeper. I'm going to place blue down here in the mouth. So that starts to take on a purple cast. Now I want to adjust my lighting so I can see what I'm doing a little bit better. I'm going to go to the light menu and I'm going to take the key light and place it at about, let's say 11 o'clock, and I'm going to set its intensity to 1. Then I'm going to turn on this secondary light and place it at about 3 o'clock, and let's set that intensity to 1. Maybe dial it back a little bit from that. So that's going to give us more clear lighting so we can see a bit better what we're doing here. Now I'm going to select yellow, and I want to grab kind of a desaturated yellow, and I'm going to paint this in the areas, well, I'm going to paint it pretty much all over, but I'm going to cluster it in the areas where the bone is closest to the skin. I'm going to bring it through the bridge of the nose and the cheeks here, bring it into the ears. Now watch what happens once we get down towards the blue. Once we start painting the yellow into the blue area, the skin starts to take on a greenish cast. I'm going to go to my material settings, wax modifiers, and I'm going to turn my wax modifier down a little bit. I just had a bit too much translucency going. Down here in the neck, I'm going to start spraying yellow into the neck, just like so. Now I'm going to switch back to my red. And I'm just going to warm up some of these areas again. Make sure that we've definitely got a clear sense of what areas are warm and what areas are cool. When we're doing this, you want to make sure that you don't make your dots too big. Make sure you keep your draw size relatively small, and that's going to help you get a better effect. There we go. And let's switch back to our yellow. Put a little bit of that in the eye socket. And there we go. So now we put down red, yellow, and blue. So we put down our three primary colors. The next step that we're going to do is what's called a mottling pass. That's M-O-T-T-L-I-N-G. Sometimes people call it a squiggle pass or a figure 8 pass. Basically, we're going to take the same standard brush, change to the drag rectangle stroke, and then we're going to change our alpha to alpha 22, this squiggly alpha here. And we're going to change our color to white. Now we're going to dial back our RGB intensity a bit, and we're going to start drawing all these little squiggly lines all over the character. And I definitely don't want to do this with symmetry turned on, because once you get towards the center line of the head, it's going to be very apparent that it's symmetrical. It'll create little patterns that look like maybe a Rorschach ink blot test. Now what we're doing here is we're just breaking up this whole underpainting with a middle painting. This is going to be between the underpainting, that temperature pass, and the subsequent layers of paint. And the reason we're doing squiggles of white is because white tends to neutralize and cool off the color that it's mixed with or it's near. So everything that's underneath this semi-transparent white squiggle is going to be neutralized and it's going to be less saturated. And then everything in between the squiggles is going to maintain its intensity. Now what that means, it's going to create kind of an interference pattern. It's going to make the skin feel more translucent because we're going to have all these little fibrous squiggles in it that are going to break up the perception of the color. And we don't just use white for squiggling. I do it for the first pass, but we may go in with purple, we may go in with reds. As you keep painting, you'll find that this mottling technique is extremely useful to break up the skin texture and make things feel more realistic. So we're just going to go through here and paint on the lips. Let's break up the lip patterning. Break up the cheeks. Now the big mistake people tend to make with the mottling pass is they either make it too bright or they make the squiggles too big. Keep them pretty tight and concentrated around the center of the face, the center of interest. And we're going to paint over this, so we don't want it to be too bright, but we don't want it to be so faint that we don't get the effect of the squiggles. So try and get it about like what you're seeing me doing on screen here. The beautiful thing about Polypaint is that we can paint directly on the model like this. It's not like Mari or any other like 3D paint application where you paint into a paint buffer and then you have to drop that paint buffer and bake it into the UV space and then rotate. Because we're painting directly onto the vertices, we can just keep painting and moving around. There's no delay. It's exactly like holding an object in your hand and applying color to it as you move it around. Being completely independent of UVs, this means that I can paint my skin long before I lay out any sort of UV coordinates and then bake out the texture later. And those UV coordinates can of course change, and then I can bake out the texture again. If you want to know more about UVs, I've got an entire video where we talk about UVs in Zbrush that I recommend that you take a look at. So I just want to break this up with more of these squiggles. They can get a little bit bigger as you get further from the center of interest of the face. But don't make them too big. If they're too big, they'll really draw attention to themselves. Let's get the cheeks here. Down here I've turned on X symmetry, so I'm doing both sides of the cheeks at the same time. And I'm going to turn it off once I get close to the center line, because we never want that to be symmetrical at the center, because it'll be painfully obvious that it's symmetrical if you paint these squiggles at the center line that way. And just making sure that these crisscross in slight variations of size and angle. Anytime we're painting a creature, I always strive to paint with broken up dots of color and various passes of mottling and squiggling. And these layers will build up together and create a very, very interesting, very realistic skin texture. It's much more desirable than just going in and selecting a color and painting it down solid. We always kind of want to add these as broken up passes of color. So there we go. There's our mottling pass. Make sure we get a little bit more in the nose area here. And into that eye socket. There we go. Now I'm going to select my base color again. I can just click here on the swatch and then drag over to the back of the head and grab the base color. I'll switch back to my spray stroke and dots alpha 7. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint the base color back onto the model. Now don't turn up your RGB intensity and obliterate your underpainting. We want to rely on doing multiple passes of this base color and just gently push the underpainting down into the skin. So as I start spraying these dots on here, you'll see all that color start to appear like it's sinking down into the skin and becoming more subtle. And again, it's going to become a little chalky, but we don't want to completely obliterate what we've done before. So even though it becomes a little chalky, we're still going to go in and accentuate by bringing back the primary and secondary colors with more passes of dots, but we're going to do it a little bit more subtly now that we're getting towards the end of the painting. So let's push these hues back here. Spray this down into the neck. And if you watch the neck now, the areas where I painted blue down in the hollows, they're starting to really feel like that's arterial blood in there. That's just that sort of bruised differentiation in the skin texture down in the recesses. It starts to really feel like it's living under the skin rather than a color painted on it. So we go to my lighting here, go to my secondary light, turn that off. We go to my primary key light, bring that up here. Go back to my secondary light, turn it on. I'm just going to move that up here. Just want to adjust the lighting so I can see the forms of the face a little bit better. And there we go. Maybe push some of this back into the face a little bit more. Anywhere where the squiggles are super apparent, I might push them in a little bit more, but there's going to be more layers that go on top of this. So if you can still see the squiggles, that's not a problem. Don't get rid of them completely. But I do want to get all those first layers of paint to feel like they're sitting a little bit deeper inside the skin. There we go. So our next stage is to go back to our primary colors. I'm going to go back to red, and I'm going to leave my RGB intensity turned down now, and I'm going to reestablish some of the warm areas. Now we're going to be far more subtle this time. We're not going to go in at the full opacity like we did in the temperature pass. This time I'm just trying to gently warm up these areas. Trying to get rid of some of that chalkiness that spraying of the base tone back on did. Bring this up into the ears. Bring this back into the mouth. Whenever I'm painting a monster, I like to make the eyes and the mouth look real irritated or kind of bruised. I just think it's a nice, unsettling effect. We'll go back to blue now. And I'm going to paint blue into the mouth area. Bring a little bit of blue back down here. I'm going to turn off perspective. Now I'm going to go to a brown. I'm going to go over here to red, and I'm going to pull the cursor down here and make what's called a raw umber. That's a cool brown. And I'm going to change my alpha to alpha 40. It's a very, very small alpha. And now we're going to start putting sort of age spots, freckling in the skin texture. And this is one of my favorite parts. This is where it really starts to come together for me, is when we start putting these little dots of pigmentation in the skin. So let's go ahead and get these freckles in there. And I'm just doing a full pass over the whole character. In traditional media, this would typically be done with a hard bristle brush dipped in pigment, and you would just flick it at your sculpture and it would spit out these little dots of color. And the effect this has, it just really brings the skin together for me and starts to feel like sort of aged or weathered skin once you've got these little bits of pigmentation, these freckling or whatever you want to call it, going through the entirety of the character. I'm going to go to my lighting, and I'm going to turn off the secondary light now. I want to see a little bit more dramatic lighting. Now, if I want to see exactly what I'm painting, I can change my material to the flat color material. And because I filled it with basic material too, I need to go to the material swatch here and go to color, fill object, and that fills it with the flat material, and I can see exactly what's going down on the surface now. I might switch color here and select the base tone, go back to my spray stroke, and I want to spray that base color into the lower portion of the face a little bit more. So I'm going to go through here and do a little bit more spraying the base color through here. Now, nothing's happening because I need to turn on RGB. Remember, if you have material on, you need to switch back to RGB to get that base color back. So I just want to bring some of that base tone back up through here. And now we'll switch back to our basic material too. And there we go, that's feeling a bit better now. I'm going to go to my material modifiers, and if I want to see a bit brighter color, I can bring diffuse up, and that will make it a bit easier to see the texture. Let's switch to red again. Turn down our RGB intensity. I just want to gently bring some of that red back in here. So we're basically playing a game going back and forth, tweaking the warmth and the coolness of the head as we paint. Now I'm going to start selecting some secondary and tertiary colors. I'm going to grab a real deep purple here, and I'm going to speckle that into the eye sockets here because I really want to accentuate the sort of bruised quality around the eyes. Come over here on this side and do it again. And do it into the mouth area here. Now I'm going to select a burgundy, like a real deep red. I'm going to do the same thing down here under the nostrils and in the mouth. Speckling out of the corners of the mouth here. Oops, I accidentally turned off quick edit mode. There we go. I'm going to change to my drag rectangle stroke, and we're going to do another mottling pass in selected areas. I'm going to mottle out, squiggle out some of these dark burgundy colors coming out of the mouth. So we get this spidering of veins coming out through the face here. I'm going to do the same thing in the eye area. Let's turn up our RGB intensity just slightly so we get a little bit sharper veins there. And I want to put these broken capillaries around the nostrils here, so I'm going to break up the color around the nose, letting these sort of spider veins cluster around the edges of the nostrils. That was a bit too intense. Let's dial back our RGB intensity on those. There we go. I'm going to go back to the spray stroke and go back to a smaller alpha, let's say alpha 47, and I'm going to select white. Now I'm going to speckle some white through here, just all through the head, very, very subtly. And this will have a similar effect to the mottling pass that we did in white earlier. Just gently going over various areas, adding a little bit of speckling. Going back to my red, bringing a little bit more red into the chest here, maybe up the sternomastoid muscles. Just bringing a little bit more flush into that area. And I'll go back to my raw umber, and I'll go to alpha 47, the slightly larger dot. I'm just going to put a few bigger age spots through the nose and the cheeks here. I'm going to go to draw, change my perspective distortion a little bit. There we go. Let's change to our flat color material, and you can see what our texture map looks like in flat shade. Go back to our basic material 2, and there we see it with translucency. So that is how you'll use Polypaint to paint a creature skin from the ground up, with no projections, just painting raw color and mixing color on your object. Now, we also have a video on Spotlight, which is projecting photo reference onto a model for texturing. I think it's very important to understand the idea behind speckling and mottling because, for example, if I'm painting an actor at work, you're never going to have perfect reference for the ear because the ear will always have shadows in the photography. So I'll typically have to paint ears and the back of necks and under chins. There's areas of the face I'll always have to hand paint. So by combining this type of technique with projection techniques, you're able to really get in there and hand paint where necessary and project where possible. And whenever I'm painting a creature, I'm pretty much always trying to paint by hand. And it's quite a bit of fun. And it's a pretty simple process, as you can see. Just takes a bit of practice to get the hang of it. And I think you'll really enjoy it. I hope you've enjoyed this video. There's a couple things that I want to point out before we move on. Under the Polypaint menu, there's a new tool in ZBrush 2020 called Adjust Colors. Now, I have an entire video in this series just dedicated to this tool. What it does is it allows you to make changes to your Polypaint using these sliders down here. So, for example, I can shift my HSV, and we can mask out specific colors using these swatches and make changes right here globally to our Polypaint. Now, I encourage you to watch that video because there's quite a bit of great information about that tool. Also, there is another video on Z-App-Link, which is found under the document menu. Z-App-Link allows us to texture using all the tools inside of Photoshop and the tools in ZBrush. So it's a really powerful way of leveraging the strengths of both applications. So I recommend that you go check out that video as well, because there's so much you can do with Polypaint. But the purpose of this lecture was to give you the basic understanding of how to set up your brushes and how to go about polypainting. So I hope you've enjoyed watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thank you.